Some of the most fun chemistry is the kind you can eat. This year for Christmas I'm taking over the traditional cinnamon bread production, and breads offer a variety of chemistry that's interesting to explore. But first, I have to get acquainted with my early Christmas present. Let's dive in, okay? Or at least try to. Okay. I like the minimalist packaging, that's great. Remove before use. Okay, here we have everything. I've got the wire whip, the flat beater, and the Captain Dough hook. This is what we'll be using for the cinnamon bread. I'm going to wash everything up, wait for the sun to move out of my face, and then do a test batch of cinnamon bread and see if I can actually cook, or bake, I suppose is the word. Here's the assortment of ingredients for both the bread and the cinnamon filling. The recipe is intended for 2 regular-sized loaves, but we've modified it to make 3 smaller loaves instead. The water has been microwaved for about 30 seconds, so it's lukewarm. I should also note that this video is not sponsored, even though everything is basically the same brand. That's just my preference. For easy reference, here are all of the ingredients and quantities for 1 batch of bread and for the filling, which in hindsight I would recommend doubling. There wasn't enough for 3 loaves, and it's much better to have a little extra than not enough. To prepare the filling, you basically combine the 3 ingredients together, mix it up really well, and put it on the side for later. Here's a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar. Now on to the uncooperative bag of brown sugar. Even though it's a brand new bag, it turns out to be unusually clumpy, even for brown sugar. We'll need a total of 2 tablespoons. And finally the cinnamon. 1 tablespoon is what I'm aiming for. It turns out the real cinnamon challenge is dispensing it without looking like a fool. I apparently failed. Good enough. Now just mix it up until it's as even as you can possibly make it. Because the particle sizes aren't even close to being the same, it doesn't want to mix up very well. For the production batches, I'm probably going to call upon some power tools to do this a little bit more efficiently, especially since I'm going to be making quite a lot of it. This is about as good as I can make it, and that's good enough. As you can see though, it does want to separate out if you shake it up a little bit. Okay, now we can move on to the dough. Before beginning, remember to make sure the water is lukewarm. Everything but the flour and butter are mixed together now. I'll start with 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. Next, a tablespoon of salt. Now I'll add the 2 cups of lukewarm water. Once the water's in, whisk it up a little bit to get some of the sugar and the salt to dissolve. Finally, add in the yeast. We use the quick rise stuff to avoid having 2 proving steps. Whisk it around for a few seconds, and then watch to make sure bubbles are forming. If not, the bread probably won't rise properly. So what makes bread rise anyway? Well, biochemistry. Baker's yeast is a strain of the single-celled microorganism Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Oof. Give me the hardest chemical name to try and pronounce over genus and species any day. Anyway, this organism breaks down sugars like sucrose into carbon dioxide and ethanol. The salt in this mix helps to inhibit the growth of yeast, and the butter we're going to add in a minute might also help to slow down yeast growth. As the sucrose is broken down into ethanol and carbon dioxide, the dough captures the bubbles of gas, which form pockets inside. As the bread bakes, the dough hardens around where the bubbles formed and makes the bread very porous. At baking temperatures, the alcohol is also evaporated. Now, there's nothing that suggests the alcohol contributes to the porosity of the bread, but I can't help but wonder if it does in some very small part. Alright, we're ready for the fun part now. Now, this is my first time using this kind of mixer, and even though I've seen my mom make this bread every year for most of my life, there's going to be some unintentional comedy along the way, and a big mess for me to clean up afterwards. During this part of the process, I'm going to add 3 cups of flour, then 1 stick of butter that has been melted, and then another 3 cups of flour. The proper way to do this is by keeping the speed at about 2 during the addition. Once everything has been added, you can crank it up a little bit to make sure everything is mixed properly. The highest I had it at was 4. Since I lost quite a bit of flour, I did end up adding a little bit more at the end. I decided to clean things up a little bit, and then that's where the flour went all over the kitchen. It was a pretty genius move, but that's why I'm practicing. Well, I suppose it could have been worse. It was a little worse. Okay, to go along with the unintentional mess, I get to make an intentional mess. That's right. Get in there. The recipe calls for the dough to be placed onto the floured counter, covered with the inverted bowl for 10 minutes, and then kneaded for 3 minutes. The filming process has had the dough standing in the mixer for at least 10 minutes, so I'm just going to get it out onto the counter, get some flour on it, and let it stand for just 1 minute. Now I get to knead the dough for 3 minutes. I was just following the recipe, but I got to wondering why. As it turns out, kneading is a lot more important than I thought. The various proteins in wheat flour start out jumbled up, but the kneading process lines them up nicely into gluten, which gives the bread its structure and is what traps the carbon dioxide bubbles. I'm a rookie, so my kneading technique is non-existent. I was just sort of flopping it around. But apparently there are right and wrong ways to knead. I did a lot of folding and pressing and beating, but stretching is another key move in hand kneading. Another method is to simply leave it in the mixer a bit longer. The main benefit to kneading by hand, besides the workout, is that an experienced baker can feel the consistency of the bread. When it's ready, the dough will feel soft and smooth and spring back from a finger poke. When I go into production, I'll probably do most of it with the machine, and then maybe a little by hand to make sure it has that silky texture. There's no way I want to knead 4 batches of this by hand though. Now that I have 3 relatively even dough balls ready, each one gets rolled in turn. I'm also rather inexperienced with a rolling pin, so this is more awkward than it should be too. Once it's rolled out, drizzle a little melted butter on it and even it out with the back of a regular tablespoon. Then sprinkle on the cinnamon and sugar filling. Roll it up so that it fits into one of the bread pans. Remember to give the pan a good spray with oil so it won't get stuck. The rolled out dough should be the width of the pan, and avoiding all of these crazy folding maneuvers that they're just wrong. Now just run through the same process on the other two. The first one was by far the worst one I did. The other two were the proper width when I rolled them out, but the trouble was that I was running out of filling. This is why I'm going to make a lot more than the recipe calls for when I go into production. I'm going to be making 4 batches for a total of 12 loaves of bread. I'm going to make enough filling for 10 batches. There's actually a running joke between my mom and I about how much extra filling she uses, so I'm disappointed that I forgot the whole point of that joke, which is to use way more filling than called for. Once they're all ready, we'll have to leave them to prove for an hour. Here's the setup for proving. It's just a blanket on a dresser near a space heater. The objective is to leave the bread rise undisturbed and draft-free for an hour. It doesn't have to be particularly warm, but it should definitely not be cool. It's about 73 degrees Fahrenheit in this room right now. I put some wax paper over the pans so that if they rise above the top of the pan, they won't get blanket all over them. There's not a lot of overlap on the sides, so I'm putting another blanket over the top of this whole thing. I'm by myself, so it's not a big deal, but if there are kids or active pets around, keep them away from the rising bread. Jumping around can cause it to flop. And here we are an hour later. You're going to want to carefully unwrap this thing and save all the rambunctious tearing for your Christmas presents. They're looking very good. They rose just about to the top of the pans, which is perfect. The next step is to transport them to the preheated oven and bake them at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 to 60 minutes. The recipe says 40 to 45, but that's not really long enough. I think it's much better tasting when it's cooled down, so here we are the next morning. I should mention that after it bakes for 45 minutes to an hour, there is a trick to tell if it's done. Just tap on the top of it, and if it sounds hollow, it's ready. It should also be slightly browned on top. To keep it fresh, I usually take it out of the pan to cut it, then put back the unused portion and keep it wrapped with aluminum foil. It usually gets eaten pretty quickly, but if it's kept covered, it stays moist for 2 to 3 days. It can be frozen, but I'm not a big fan myself. The swirls are a bit too big, so the dough should be rolled thinner than I did. And of course, it needs more cinnamon. Aside from eating it plain or with butter, it can be toasted or even made into French toast. Well, thanks a lot for watching, and Merry Christmas. Some of the most fun chemistry is the kind you can eat. What was I going to say again? There's plenty of chemistry to be explored with bread. Bread offers... Sun's right there. Okay, here we have everything. Wire... What do they call it? Wire whisk. The family recipe of... What? Families... Dang it! Dang it. Fun chemistry... Let me start with my mouth closed. Jeez. This shooting live business is really hard.